Blog Talk Radio. Welcome to Research at the National Archives and Beyond Blog Talk Radio. This is your host, Bernice Alexander Bennett, and co-host Patricia Glover Howard. Hi, Patricia.
Good evening, Bernice. How are you?
Girl, I'm ready for this tonight. Well, everyone, Patricia will monitor the chat room and post comments concerning our discussion tonight. Well, I'm happy to welcome the callers and chatters to Research at the National Archives and Beyond. This show will provide individuals interested in genealogy and history an opportunity to listen, learn, and take action. If you have logged in as a guest and you wish to participate in the chat, please sign in through your Blog Talk Radio account. Well, tonight's show will focus on a film entitled By Any Other Name, an exploration of Afro-American Indian heritage with Stephen Gayle. Stephen Gayle is a filmmaker and educator originally from Philadelphia and now residing in the Atlanta area. He earned his bachelor's in history education from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke and a Master of Arts in Media and Communications from Norfolk State University. He is currently pursuing his Ph.D. in International Conflict Management at Kennesaw State University. He has worked in the educational and media production fields for nearly a decade and is constantly seeking new ways to incorporate the two disciplines in different formats. Most recently, he has focused on his research on genealogy and American and African American and Native American history. And his latest project, By Any Other Name, an exploration of Afro-American heritage. So he is hoping that this film will stand as a meaningful contribution in the realm of historical documentaries and in understanding both the African American and Native American diasporas. So let me give a warm welcome to Stephen D. Gayle to Research at the National Archives and Beyond Blog Talk Radio. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, thank you for having me on the show.
Well, I'm so glad that you reached out to be on the show. So you
definitely
have selected an intriguing research project. So give us some background on this project.
You know, growing up, I knew very little about my ancestry and my family history. And one of the things like we would always kind of throw out there from time to time, where we kind of would talk about this idea that somebody in our family was descended from a Native American. And, you know, I always kind of dismissed it and looked at it as one of those things that, you know, every African American seems to have that kind of claim in their family history. And there's very little to verify it one way or the other. And so I just kind of overlooked it in the same way that we look at African-American history as this nebulous thing, our ancestry rather, as this nebulous thing where you can never really find out the truth. And you can never really find out the truth of your origin or anything like that. So over time, as I got older, and as we started losing people in the family that kept a lot of that family history going, I started paying more attention to our family history and what was available to us. And I noticed there wasn't a lot, that everybody in the family actually knew regarding that. So I just wanted to keep going with it and researching it and asking around and asking different family members what did they know and what could I, start incorporating in my research, just as a project or a personal project more than anything. And I started, as I kept going on with the research, my mother actually said, this would be a good film. You should do a documentary on this. And I was like, well, I don't know, maybe, one day, I don't know. And it wasn't until I actually relocated to Georgia, where my great-grandmother was actually from, that I started taking it a little bit more seriously, and I started really looking into it because I was like, well, I've never been to Georgia prior to that, but now I'm here, so I feel like I'm here for a reason, and maybe that reason is to learn more about my family history in this state, if nothing else. So I kind of took it upon myself to create this film, and in the process, I wanted to not just be, a vanity project about my own family history, but to kind of talk about the larger questions that come up when you discuss this topic. And so I wanted to talk about what does that look like for everybody, what all these individuals that have dismissed their own ancestry or their own ancestral claims or, their history, their family history. What does that sound like? What does that look like when you really start unpacking it? What does it look like when we start acknowledging and stop ignoring? And so I decided just to kind of move forward with the project and create a film around it and see what we could do. How far could I really go with my research, and how can that be linked to other aspects of the Black experience and African American history and understanding ourselves as African Americans in this country. And then I think there's larger implications beyond the United States even. But I at least wanted to have something that kind of started a conversation about this and gave it some academic credence, because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of half-truths, and a lot of omissions, I feel, in academia and outside of academia amongst personal researchers that kind of just, everybody just wants to omit this kind of history or this interaction between these two people groups at very interesting points of our collective history. So I decided to move forward with the project with that in mind. And and now I'm here with showing the film and discussing it and trying to expand on it in as many ways as I can.
Well, tell us, what have you uncovered through your research and trying to figure out where did this come from, and how do the two groups kind of come together? As you said, you're trying to figure this out.
Right. So with my family, I followed my maternal grandfather, his line, and he would at the time he recently passed, but at the time when I interviewed him, he just said, both of his parents had Native American ancestry. One was from Tennessee, the other one was from Georgia, and there was little else that was really known about that. So I kind of followed the line that I was closest to in terms of location, because I felt like there'd be more leads in that regard. So I started with my great-grandmother, Edna Pettigrew, and she was born in the late 1800s, and I think the age ranges in my family really aided that process. Because she was born in the late 1800s, her father actually had her pretty late in life. She was the youngest of her siblings, and he had her when he was close to 70 years old, I believe, 60, 70 years old possibly, because he was born in the 1830s. So, and it was a range in terms of when he was born, as I'm sure you're familiar with the date ranges that come with genealogical research when it comes to, figuring out when people are born. It kind of ranges sometimes 10-year spans. And, as I started looking at this history, there were a lot of holes where I feel like, there shouldn't have been. There were certain census records, like 1880 census records, where people
that they were descendants, or someone was a descendant of a Native American person. So
Right.
Tell us more about that.
So the film follows the subject. The main subject that I'm tracing is, or the line that I'm tracing is through my great-grandmother. And as I was saying, she was born in the late 1800s, but then her father was born in the 1830s, and then his mother was born, according to records, in the late 1700s, like 1790s, or in that range. And so it kind of lends itself to a historical analysis using certain historical events, to kind of frame it for people. And that's kind of it just kind of lined up that way, so I decided to tell the story in that way. So I talked about how the Atlanta riots impacted the black community in Georgia, how Indian removal, which happened in the 1830s, coincided with the time period in which one of my family members was born. So essentially I just tried to give people a framework for understanding using a variety of historical events to kind of frame it for them, using my genealogy. And as I said, I wanted to focus on the larger picture, but using the specificity of my family history.
Right. So when you say focus on the larger picture, tell us exactly where you're going with the larger picture, because you have so many people of African descent who, to this day, are saying that they had Native ancestry. But are you saying that perhaps this is not true? Are you trying to help them figure it out, or just have this dialogue? When did this enter the whole part of our family history where Native American ancestry and the African American community seems to be a prominent piece of focus for them?
Well, I think that overall, I think when you start to see it come up, it always seems to kind of range to, someone's great-grandmother, and it's always unverified. And one of the things that I found over time is that in most cases, I think that you can usually trace it back to somebody who is classified as mulatto on record, and in most cases. Now, I think it ranges, but, my overall goal wasn't to say that one individual was, or several people are saying that they're Native American, or these groups of people are more likely to be than this group, or, that really wasn't my focus. I think my focus is more so about, what does this look like when we give it some level of credibility? What happens when we actually say, well, what if this is true? Just looking on the other side of the coin and just trying to investigate that, as opposed to the trend, which seems to be to immediately dismiss it. I try to find, just other angles of looking at it and just saying, okay, well, I'm not automatically saying that it's true. I'm not going to dive off the deep end, but, not take anything for face value. And I noticed as I kept researching, when I was looking at these records, I was starting to see the discrepancy in terms of how records were kept or how classifications changed, and how there's different incentives in documenting people a particular way. So, for instance, one of the things that I thought was very interesting was the presence of Native American slavery. Now, we talk about that in history classes from time to time, but it's always from the colonial period, and then it kind of just ends. And the narrative that gets put out there a lot of times in academia is that, well, Native Americans, they were enslaved early on in the colonial period, and then after that, it was kind of discontinued. It wasn't really effective, and, in turn, they turned to Africa and brought African slaves to America, and that's how, things are today, right? But one of the things I noticed was that it kind of lends itself to a racist narrative that I think gets overlooked but still endorsed. So, like, for instance, you say that Native Americans were enslaved, but they were worked to death so much because they couldn't handle slavery. And I think that pushes this particular narrative. And that narrative is that Africans are more conducive to servitude. And I think that's an ideology. That's an ideological element that gets pushed, but it's not speaking to the facts. It's not speaking to history. And so, I tried to explore that a little bit more, because I just came off the premise that I just refuse to believe that all these people just died and you decided to go with Africans and then that was it. And as I started looking at the colonial records, you start looking at newspapers, you see the presence of Native Americans, of East Indians, all being a part of this chattel slavery system right alongside us throughout the entire slavery period in the United States. And it's present in the publications, it's present in certain laws, but it's not present in our history books, and it's not present in our minds when we're doing this research. And our first go-to is just to say that, we were misled, or we have a misunderstanding, or there's some level of dishonesty at work. But I think there's a level of academic dishonesty when you don't address it. Because I look at, for instance, the laws I brought up in the film, for Georgia specifically, the Georgia law, the Act for Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes in this province, and that was the 1850s. They established that all Indians, Negroes, and mulattoes and mestizos were deemed as slaves, absolute slaves, unless they were under a certain classification, unless they were in good standing with the government, or the colonial government. So that means any tribe that wasn't in line with the government was therefore a slave and was subject to the same treatment as an African being brought into Georgia. And when you take into consideration that, the Cherokee, or not the Cherokee, but the Creek Confederacy was just that, it was a confederacy of multiple tribes. Those tribes didn't all move in one accord. They had their own ideas about what the government should do, or what land should be held. So there were different people on that spectrum. So who's to say that the one tribe that disagreed wasn't lumped in with us and therefore subject to slavery? And it's just to open up that door, not necessarily to say, or jump to conclusions and say that this individual is now Indian because of this particular law, but just to say that, there was a law that existed that made these people slaves. There were ways that we counted people on federal census records that allowed for this leeway to occur, So it was more so just to kind of present an alternative theory that I think isn't really pushed out there very often.
Okay, so I have several questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, when you spoke of Georgia, was Georgia your only focus?
Initially,
or
yes.
Did you take it broader?
For the film purpose and for the narrative purpose, I focused on Georgia specifically. There was a segment where we went to South Carolina, right along the border, but I also felt that segment was pertinent because it kind of addressed individuals that kind of conflicted with the narrative, and that was the segment where we talked to a group of Yamasee Indians in South Carolina. And so, and as I presented in the film, they conflicted with historical narratives, but they, like I said, they were in North Carolina, but they also kind of have the Georgia and Florida ties. So I wanted to kind of incorporate that as well. But for the most part, I just focused on Georgia, but the larger implications of what Georgia means for the rest of the country. The film itself, I think, was just kind of like the foundation for a larger conversation, because this topic is so broad that it has to be studied in a comprehensive format that it has never been done. I mean, like I said, like the film doesn't discuss, it discusses slavery amongst Native Americans as both slaves and enslavers, but it doesn't really go into the question about the freedmen, of various tribes. It doesn't go into slavery in the North or the Native American influence and presence in the Northeast or in the Mid-Atlantic or in the Southwest or in the West Coast or in the Caribbean and Central and South America, and there's so many ways that this could go. And I didn't want, my desire to talk about that to unravel the narrative, because the narrative was there as like the core to help people understand.
Well, welcome back to Research at the National Archives and Beyond Blog Talk Radio. This is your host, Bernice Alexander Bennett, with co-host Patricia Glover Howard, and you can join us every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will have an expert to share resources, stories, and answer your burning genealogy and history questions. Remember, all of my guests share a deep passion and knowledge of genealogy and history. All of my shows are available as a podcast immediately after the broadcast, and they can be downloaded from Blog Talk Radio, iTunes, TuneIn.com, and Stitcher.com. Well, you have been listening to Stephen Gayle discussing his research and documentary entitled By Any Other Name, An Exploration of Afro-American Heritage. Now, Stephen, I want you to take us back. I want you to take us all the way back to your thesis of what are you doing, what are you trying to do, because I understand your intent is to do more in-depth research. So tell us about the research and what are you looking for and what kind of people you want to help you engage in this research. Well,
as I said before, the topic is so vast and so understudied, I believe. I remember reading a book by a guy named Jack Forbes. And in the prologue to his book, I believe it's African Americans and Native Americans. It had different titles at different points in time, in different editions. But in most of his work, he always addressed this need for a more in-depth study on the topic. And the more I kept looking into it, I realized how scattered information on this topic is, and again, how easily it falls into the air of misinformation and a lot of misunderstanding. And I think, so for me, I wanted to kind of at least open the door to that. But the more I kept doing it, the more I kept noticing how little is really discussed about it and how scattered it is. So my overall goal is to hopefully establish a center that handles that in terms of, or addresses that issue, in terms of creating comprehensive research based around that. So an African American and Native American Cultural Research Center that addresses the multi-tiered issues facing African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos from a historical perspective, but then also addresses through various workshops and outreach in a contemporary perspective, because all three groups have certain socioeconomic issues that we're facing. And I believe that they're all somewhat stemming from the same institutional marginalization that we're seeing, or that we've been seeing since the 1500s, or since 1492, if you want to go that far. So my overall goal is to kind of address that and hopefully mitigate some of those socioeconomic or negative socioeconomic issues that you're seeing within these communities by addressing the elephant in the room, which is the overlap between all three of these groups. And I think that's fundamental in understanding and unpacking the generational trauma that we've all experienced, or the lack of documentation, the lack of accurate documentation, the legal system playing such a heavy hand in how we identify ourselves, how we identify others, and how that plays a role in our livelihoods. And so right. I think by facing that head on in the form of just understanding the fundamental question of who we are and what does that look like. African Americans are a multicultural people. We're an international people, but we're rarely viewed like that, and we rarely view ourselves that way. What happens if we just look on the other side of that coin, And what happens when we really start to address all the parts of our whole, of the whole of us, Address ourselves in the entirety.
But you are dealing with a very challenging topic. And I'll just quote from a chatter. The challenge is that the subject often is one-sided, coming exclusively from the African American reaching out to the Native side. The narrative rarely comes from the Native reaching out to the African. So, and sometimes the attitudes from one side to the other can bring about surprising discussions.
Right. And I think, and I think just in that issue or just in that question, you can kind of see the issue, or see the multitude of issues. So, for instance, like the idea of us always going to them, this idea of us and them. Like just that dichotomy, like unpacking that, that takes a certain level of work. It takes a certain level of give and take, and sometimes it takes more give than take. I think there's a lot to unpack when it comes to talking about our ancestry. But just because one party is reluctant, we have people of European descent in this country who are reluctant to talk about their slave-owning ancestors, that are reluctant to come off of pictures and records of our own family members or shared family members. That's just part of the genealogical challenge, But I think it doesn't mean that we should not, or we should lessen the effort. We should always try to strive for something different. And so, and I try to make that point clear in the film as well. Like, I'm not trying to fetishize some other group as opposed to myself or as opposed to my Africanness or anyone else's. But it's the idea of addressing this topic that, white people don't have any issue with dismissing because it doesn't pertain to them. Native Americans, some may not have an issue with omitting that or dismissing it because of what it might mean to them personally. Some of us may have a problem with addressing it because of what it means to us personally. But it doesn't mean that we should just ignore it. But there's so many things, so many roadblocks in the way that we have to address. And so, I hope that answered or addressed that question.
Well, the other part of my question to you, though, is that because you're doing research, what is your thesis and who are you looking for? Who are your subjects? What do you want your subjects to provide to you so that you can get to the next level of understanding? I mean, you start your film off basically with Dr. Henry Louis Gates asking everybody in the room, how many of you have oral history about Native American ancestry, and just about everybody raises their hand. And then he says, well, you only have, the research has shown that maybe African Americans only have maybe 5% Native ancestry, and then the rest have 0. And so what happens when you have people who have grown up with this, I have Native American ancestor with hair flowing to the ground and high cheekbones, and they come with this description, and it just doesn't fit in with any documentation to support the fact that there's Native ancestry within their family line.
Right. I think the first thing you have to do is, fundamentally unpack and deconstruct, what you believe to be factual information and the way in which that information is presented to you. Not to just, go with any rumor or go with anything that just is said, folklore or whatever that's said in your family, but unpack, what that is. It's like, well, the documentation conflicts with that. Well, let's look at the documentation. What was the incentive behind it? What was the reasoning for classifying that particular ancestor in that form? So, for instance, when you look at the mixed race categories in the census, the only reason why they would be put in there is because individuals would lobby for them. In political office, congressmen would lobby for particular categories because that would help or, hurt certain political interests. Now, so when you started seeing a drop-off or add-on of particular categories, the people, when every time a category was taken off, where did those individuals fall? So, for instance, Native Americans, if they were on the census record, if they lived off reservation land, then they were going to fall within a particular category, whether it was white, black, mulatto, and that was it in certain point, in particular areas. And then once you got to 1910, there were other categories added in. So I think the issue is that the racial classifications are not scientific. They're not based in any factual information. They're based off of arbitrary decisions. They're social constructs. And even though they give indicators about a person's background, they're not the person's background. They're just an indicator of their background. And I think when we look at these records, we have to address it or view it from that perspective. Even though we're used to saying, well, black means African. It may not necessarily be that. It may just be they're not what I think a white person should be. They're not what I think an Indian person should be. Or there's no category that classifies this individual, so we're putting them in this category. And so, when you have the rumors in your family and they conflict with that, you have to, I guess, dig deeper, but not take it at face value. So just because an individual says, well, this record says they were black, so that's what they were straight from Africa and that was it. Or this record says they were mulatto, that just means they were black and European and that was it. That may not be the case if you know how these records were even established, what the criteria was by the United States Census Bureau or the Bureau of Vital Records, like how these people were classified and what the reason was behind why they were classified as such.
And the really interesting thing, though, you're talking about the classification, but, basically it was what the eyes saw.
Right.
And if the eyes saw a dark-skinned person, then the census taker would put, well, okay, that's a black person, that's a Negro, or that's a colored person. So, as you said, the classification was kind of arbitrary.
Right.
But that may be the only documentation that people have.
Right.
It's a very complex. It's a very complex topic to deal with. It truly is. But I want to go back to my original question. Since you are doing research, who are you researching, and what are you looking for? What do you want them to provide you to help move this dialogue from oral history to where do you take it?
So I guess there's multiple angles for that, or answers rather. For the film itself, the subject was my great-grandmother's family. And who were those people? They claim that they were part Indian. Where is that evidence? And if it's true, and I'm just going off the premise of it may or may not be true, right?
Okay.
And so as I was looking through the records, what am I finding that provides me with the affirmative as well as with the negative? And so what I kind of found was you don't know. At least at this point in time, I'm not sure. And even though I can say, well, this record says this, but record said this, that, and the third. In terms of like proving beyond a reasonable doubt one way or the other. But there is a reasonable doubt in terms of if they were Native American and saying they weren't. There's a reasonable doubt for me to be like, well, there's a chance that they could have been. Based off of what criteria that they fell in, based off of geographic location, based off the time period. My second great grandfather was born in what used to be right around the border of Creek Indian Territory. Right, that land had just been acquired 10 years before he was born. So, it's hard to say unequivocally who this individual was, racially speaking. So, that in terms of the film, that's where the angle I was going with. I was, I want to find the answer, one way or the other, and it's okay. It doesn't hurt my feelings or something if my ethnicity isn't what we were told it was, and I had to be willing to confront that. But what I found as I kept researching that, all these historical events and the criteria, classifications, the information I was coming across, it wasn't lining up one way or the other. There's nothing really, concrete that could tell me one way or the other what my ancestry was. And I even took one of the DNA end of it, and there were still questions. So I just tried to take the position of, that hard-nosed juror that just wants to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, in terms of, overall picture, I personally believe there is a significant understatement of Native American and African interaction, intermingling throughout the Southeast United States, throughout the United States and throughout both continents that we're just not addressing. And I think, generally speaking, we kind of know that there was this intermingling, but where's the comprehensive study? Where's the book that I could have referenced for the film that would have helped me? And I don't really see it. And so, and I believe that there is a significant understatement. So I wanted to look at that. Like, for instance, when I used the Henry Louis Gates clip when he was in California in the film, and he said that 1 out of 20 African Americans have any significant Native American DNA, right? My first questions were, well, that 1 out of 20, where did that one person come from? that'd be the first question. The second one is what's significant? Because 1% is still a significant part of my ancestry. Because without that 1%, I'm not here. I'm a different person. So, and it also speaks to generations. And then he doesn't really go into, the genetic recombination and, how the DNA tests actually work, what the reference samples work for these kinds of conclusions. And it leaves a lot of open-endedness. So I would just want to explore that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. So while you're focusing in Georgia, are you going to take your project to another place? Do you plan on just going throughout the United States? Tell us your goal for where you're going with this.
So with the film, I've shown that at the 20th Native American Film Festival of the Southeast in Columbia, South Carolina. It's also been shown in London at the University of London, SOAS, University of London. Berkeley, California. We showed it in Cincinnati, Ohio, at the Warsaw Avenue Film Festival. And I'm currently trying to get it shown in other universities and whatnot as well. But
okay, and with this film, so you've developed the film. So is the film your project to go around, take the film, and use that film to stimulate dialogue? Or are you attempting to do something else beyond the film?
Definitely beyond the film. So the film, like I said, was just the foundation for that. So ultimately, I'm creating a follow-up web series based on the film to kind of extrapolate some of the larger themes. It won't be focused on my ancestry necessarily, but it'll be the themes that were presented in the film and expanding upon that, and kind of addressing the topic of Afro-Amerindian heritage in a variety of formats, whether it's through culture, various cultural remnants of this influence, of this commingling, through art, music, dance, culinary. There's all these different remnants. I also want to get into some of the local history, some of the stories.
I'm sorry, but we're losing your voice. Can you speak a little clearer?
So I wanted to get into some of these more, some of the remnants of the interminglings and some of these stories that we don't often hear about. So, just trying to discuss with different people in different academic fields to show how interdisciplinary this topic can be, and to show how these two groups have interacted and commingled for a very long time and have influenced each other in ways that we haven't really addressed or explored. Now that's just for web series. Now ultimately I would like
your voice is, we're not getting you really clear. So do you plan to include people from the Oklahoma freedmen who have documented ties to the 5 tribes?
Yes, now that is all essentially a budgetary issue. Initially I was intended on doing that, but we were working with a shoestring budget would be generous. So we were working with a very, very low budget creating the film, and a lot of it was out of pocket. So, and through private and family donations. So, but yeah, with the film project and with the follow-up web series, I would like to expand it to include as many people as we can, and to discuss this topic as broadly as we can. And so, ultimately, my goal was to create a cultural and research center that handles or addresses the generational trauma that African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos have experienced, because I believe that's completely linked to these issues and to this overlapping of cultures that occurred when Africans came to the Americas. I also wanted to address some of the issues through programs and various outreach programs and workshops exhibits, and publications. So creating some academic foundation, but as well as some social supports for these groups in the contemporary sense, I think would definitely aid the process and create more comprehensive study around the topic.
Right. So how can individuals get in contact with you to further discuss your plans and also share with you some of their thoughts on what they can see happening with this film and this project?
Okay. Well, the easiest way is email. You can contact me on that through BAON documentary. So by any other name, documentary. It's one word, BAON documentary at gmail.com, as well as at BAON documentary on Twitter. We're on Instagram as well, but we haven't been using that as much lately, but hopefully we'll get back to that. But definitely Twitter, Gmail, Facebook as well. Facebook.com/by-any-other-name-documentary, all one word. Contact us through that. We have postings on the regular there and links to all the other social media as well as the film. But yeah, that's probably the easiest way through Facebook.
That's probably
Twitter,
the easiest way. Okay, well, do you have any parting words for us before we close out tonight?
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you for allowing me to come on the show and speak about the film. And also, I would just like to say, this topic is very sensitive, and I try to approach it with that sensitivity. But in the face of that sensitivity, we also have to be realistic. We also have to be forthcoming, and we have to address the elephants in the room. So we have to confront some of the things that make us uncomfortable if we want to truly explore our ancestry and truly explore our history. Our history is very diverse and also very painful and also rooted in a lot of issues. So I think, as most people doing genealogical research, they get confronted with a lot of hard questions. I think this topic is a very difficult question because you never know what it can bring up. And then on top of that, it has other political and socioeconomic and economic factors at work as well. So I think when one wants to address this topic, they have to come in with a critical mind and also a very honest one. So I would say that's pretty much it. And if anybody would like to support or contact us, ask any questions, take part in any of the projects, collaborate in any way, I'm open for it.
Okay. Well, Steve, I'd like to thank you for coming on and just sharing with us your documentary, By Any Other Name, An Exploration of Afro-American Heritage. And for everyone else, please remember your ancestors left footprints, and you should follow the clues that are presented to you through oral history, family records, and research at the National Archives and beyond. You can continue this discussion on the Research at the National Archives and Beyond and Afrogenius Facebook pages. And also remember to listen to the African Roots podcast with Angela Walton Raji, and also watch for the Black Progen Live with host Nika Soul Smith. Thank you so much for joining Research at the National Archives and Beyond, Blog Talk Radio, and also check out my services at BB's Genealogy Research and Educational Services, LLC, and my website is www.geniebroots.com. Well, I look forward to all of you joining me next week. This is your host, Bernice Alexander Bennett, with co-host Patricia Glover Howard. Good night, everyone. Good night, Stephen.
Thank you. Good night.